I'm Chris Lee at the 14. Got a very special guest with me today. He's Matt Moscona. He is heard all over the radio in the state of Louisiana on ESPN affiliates. Matt, thank you for coming on today at what is a really eventful time. When's it not an eventful time on the LSU beat? But particularly this week, I would imagine that the material and the show prep just writes itself at this point.
Yeah, hey, Chris. Thanks for having me. LSU and Louisiana are by nature never boring. When you have you live in a state where like the last three insurance commissioners have all gone to federal prison, typically things are eventful here. So not surprising that amid an LSU losing streak and less than 2 years after arguably the greatest season ever, LSU is looking for a new coach.
Well, you've covered one coaching search of a major program this year. How long do you cover another?
I don't think Ed Orgeron makes it to the end of the season. I think Scott Woodward, LSU's AD, his MO is that he will let coaches finish a year. When he was at the University of Washington, he was there as the AD when Tyrone Willingham had a winless season, but let him finish out the year. Texas A&M, he let Kevin Sumlin finish out the season before he replaced him with Jimbo Fisher. This is just a different circumstance where it feels like the coach has lost the team. You can't go to Kentucky and not be competitive. And then when you throw on top of it all of the off-the-field issues surrounding LSU football and Ed Orgeron as well, it becomes much harder to justify. So Scott Woodward's very tactful. He's very smart. He is not an he does not really operate by – he's not reactionary. He will be very tempered in his response, but I think a lot of these wheels were put in motion before the season even started, Chris. And what's transpired on the field has basically validated all of that preparation.
Okay, you mentioned off-field stuff, and Title IX's a big deal there. Just walk us through what has really gotten him on the hot seat in terms of the off-field stuff down there.
So in the springtime, LSU hired an independent investigator, Hush Blackwell, to investigate complaints of Title IX violations, federal Title IX violations. Essentially, that LSU was failing to report accusations of rape and sexual assault. Now, this was not only within the athletic department, but the university as a whole. And so you have to think beyond just what we think about NCAA rule or university athletic, handbook, student code of conduct. You're talking about the U.S. Department of Education. The DOE is what's investigating LSU right now because of their failure to adequately report Title IX violations. So Ed Orgeron right now is also a defendant in two different Title IX lawsuits. This is something that predated Ed Orgeron, but has certainly continued through his tenure as LSU's head coach. There's that. And then there's also just a lot of the things that you've probably seen that have made their way around the internet. Ed Orgeron with pictures in bed with women and running shirtless on the beach. And there's a lot of things that have made their way around Twitter and message boards and that are unsightly and not what would be the expectation of the LSU head coach. And Chris, look, I've seen Ed's contract. The termination for cause section reads like an encyclopedia. It looks like it's 3/4 of the contract. So, if LSU decides that they want to move on from Ed Orgeron with cause, they certainly have a strong leg to stand on.
It surprises me, Matt, how times really successful coaches just get cocky and they feel like they're bulletproof. Is that some of what happened here?
Absolutely. Look, and Chris, listen, I want to be very clear too, because I don't want to be misunderstood. What Ed Orgeron or any coach does in their personal life is their business, and I'm not judging, anyone. With that said, when you are the head football coach at LSU and you make $8 million a year and you are the public face of the flagship university of a state, you're going to be held to a different standard. And that's not an unrealistic expectation, but it's also a burden that you bear when you take the job and you understand it. Ed Orgeron and his wife Kelly, divorced last February after the national championship, and I think a part of that was Ed. This is just me speculating. Was him sort of just letting loose a little bit, and there's so many examples of look at Urban Meyer. It would just happen. When you're in the public eye, especially in a place like Louisiana, where the football coach at LSU is probably the most famous person in the state, people are always watching you. And unfortunately for Ed, that's his personal life and some of his escapades have gotten a lot of attention for the wrong reasons.
If they have a coaching search, which everybody thinks is going to happen,
they will.
Where do you think they go? Well, first of all, Scott Alexander, he swings big, Scott Woodward, excuse me.
Scott Woodward.
I knew I had it wrong. He swings big. He did it in baseball. He did it in women's hoops. Presumably, he's the guy running the search. I mean, sometimes it's university presidents, sometimes it's boosters. Who's running things down there?
One interesting dynamic, and you're right about Woodward swinging for the fences. Remember, he got Chris Peterson away from Boise whenever he was the AD at University of Washington. He hired Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M. You're right about Kim Mulkey and Jay Johnson at LSU were his first two hires. So he does not go bargain shopping. I mean, he is big game hunting. There's no question. That's what Scott does. The interesting dynamic is that LSU does have a new university president, William Tate, who's only been on the job just several months. So that's one variable, Chris, we really don't know, is how much does the new university president want to inject himself into this conversation. It is worth mentioning that that Tate is an African-American. He's the first African-American president at LSU. And I think it's worth considering that, if you have a president's office that for the first time is more diverse now than it has ever been in the history of the university, which is more than 150 years, might the president want a more diverse search for a coaching hire? Perhaps. There may be someone that Scott Woodward has at the top of his list, but is there pressure to have to cast a wider net, to vet more candidates that otherwise might not be considered I don't want to say a Rooney Rule of sort, because that doesn't exist in college, obviously, but something along those lines maybe, and that's something that could certainly be considered. Look, there's already names being thrown out. Bill O'Brien is a name we've heard. Lane Kiffin, although I think Lane isn't squeaky clean, and I do think this is going to be a very clean hire, scandal-free hire for the reasons we kind of already mentioned. I've heard Luke Fickell. I've heard James Franklin. I've heard Mel Tucker up in Michigan State. Those are some of the names that are being tossed about, and I don't think you completely rule out Jimbo Fisher either, because remember, Jimbo has no buyout at A&M. Despite the big contract, he has no buyout. And that's the deal that Scott Woodward did with Jimmy Sexton when Scott was at A&M. And Scott Woodward and Jimmy Sexton are both are very good friends. So there's a lot of political interplay here that could come into play whenever when you look at what this hire is going to be.
We went into the wrong business. We should have been agents or coaches. I mean, the contracts for elite coaches are so one-sided now. I saw the same thing on Fisher. I'm like, I cannot believe you have a coach who can just leave and get paid that much money and not have another side to the coin.
The flip side of it is that was the deal that that was the deal that Scott Woodward brokered with Jimmy Sexton, and Jimbo got his big deal, but that buyout works both ways. He could be fired and not owed anything. So, and that was something he was willing to take. And I guess after this past Saturday, probably looks okay after they beat Alabama. But he certainly had his ups and downs. But that's one that I don't know, Chris, that I would tell you that's Jimbo would be a definitive front runner or anything. But it would also be negligent to ignore his name as a possibility.
Yeah. Let's talk the team. It has gone from bad to worse. LSU was shut out in the first half at Kentucky, which is a good team, but that shouldn't happen to LSU. The injuries are piling up. It sounds like Stingley's probably done for the year. Kayshon Boutte done for the year. They've got, I think, 3 other starters out at least. Ali Gay, I think, is out for the Florida game. I mean, between that and just when a season goes south, like Auburn is a program where you've seen this at, when it just goes bad, it just falls apart. And I'm just wondering what the state of this team is. Do they have enough to put it together through the rest of the season? I know they're very talented, but they've already lost a lot of games with those guys. So where does it go from here?
I think a big part of it depends on if and when they make a coaching move. Watching that game at Kentucky was just, and I understand. I mean, that was taking place at the time that A&M was orchestrating an upset of Alabama. There probably weren't a lot of people watching LSU Kentucky. People probably saw highlights and what happened, but LSU allowed 330 rush yards to Kentucky. Kentucky's a very good team, but in no reality should LSU lose any conference game like that. That's the first time Kentucky won an SEC game by more than 20 points since 1998, and that was against Vanderbilt. Whoa. And I no disrespect to Vanderbilt, Chris, but they mentioned on the broadcast, like you're LSU, there is a standard and expectation, and that's not it. So if Ed Orgeron remains in place, it is hard to imagine this team getting off the mat. They've got Florida this week at 11 a.m. in Tiger Stadium, and brother, I'm here to tell you, I'd be surprised if there's more than 60,000 people in the stadium for an 11 a.m. kickoff after this. Then they go to Ole Miss. And if you have a listless team and you're facing that offense, that could get ugly in a hurry. Then you have your open date, then you go to Alabama. So, what's bad could absolutely get worse for this team. I think they have 2 more wins in them. I think they beat ULM. And I think they'll play their best game of the season somewhere along the way and win another conference game. Maybe it's Arkansas. Maybe it's their regular team plays their best game at some point during the season. And for LSU, if it's on the right Saturday, they have a chance to get another conference win. There's enough talent there to get another conference win. But it's also unrealistic to think that this team would be anything above 500. And I think they'd be lucky to get to 500.
How do they give up that many rushing yards to Kentucky? I know Kentucky's good, but let's be honest, that's not a team that steamrolls you on offense. They have some good running backs. LSU always recruits defensive linemen. Always. How does it get to the point where they're just getting smashed like that in the run game?
And that's Ed Orgeron's forte, is as a defensive line coach. Personnel is part of it. And, another part is LSU has a new defensive coordinator in Durante Jones, who has really struggled to match wits against some of the better play callers in this league. It's Chris, that's another indictment on Ed Orgeron, is after last season when they went 5-5 and literally had the worst defense in the history of LSU. They allowed 35 a game last year. It was literally the worst defense in LSU football history. They replaced both coordinators and 6 staff members. So Ed Orgeron was allowed to turn over half his staff, including his coordinators. And he hired Jake Peetz on offense and Durante Jones on defense, neither of whom had been a coordinator. Ooh. If you're on the chopping block, man, and you got to nail these hires, you would think you'd go with someone a little more established, or really established, especially at a place like LSU where you have the resources to pay coordinator 7 figures. Yeah. And Ed instead hired 2 guys who'd never done the job before. And you're seeing a lot of those growing pains. You asked specifically about allowing 300 rush yards to Kentucky. I mean, Kentucky's zone rushing offense was rolling, and LSU didn't have good gap fits, and that on top of the personnel issues, you saw what you saw. And and then you look this week, they're going to take on Florida, who's a better rushing offense than Kentucky. So that's why I say I don't think it's going to get better this week.
The coordinator thing, that's just a red flag. I mean, I'm seeing it in Nashville with Vanderbilt. They've hired a first-year offensive coordinator, and it's been a disaster, a guy who's never done that before. At LSU, with all the resources that school has, I don't understand how you do that. Now, look, I know the criticism of him sometimes is he meddles and he gets over-involved. Is that just a case of it's easier to exert your will when you hire 2 greenhorns?
I don't know that Ed meddles. I don't know if that's a fair criticism. I think he's just identified. I think Ed Orgeron is not good at identifying coaching talent. Remember, he's never been a coordinator. And I think genuinely he doesn't know what he's looking for in assistants. When he got here, he inherited Dave Aranda from Les Miles. His first coordinator hire was Matt Canada, and that blew up on him after 1 year. And then he promoted Steve Ensminger, who was already on staff, hired by Les Miles. When Dave Aranda left for Baylor, Ed hired Bo Pelini, and that blew up on him after a year. Steve Ensminger retired. He had to replace both coordinators, and you have what you have right now. There's just so much evidence over Ed's time here that when he has had to make the hire, he just doesn't know what he's looking for in coaching talent. It's a product of a guy who is a really good defensive line coach, who's a great energy guy, who's a great recruiter in his career, but is not a great head coach. Just does not know how to be the general leading the Army.
I want to talk some SEC for a minute, Matt. I don't know how much of the Alabama game you got to watch because you had your hands full watching LSU. Really some defects exposed in Alabama. I was surprised at how poorly they performed on the lines of scrimmage at times. No, give credit to A&M. That's a really talented bunch. The secondary's got some leaks. Do you have any sense of where this is headed? Because sometimes they'll look vulnerable for a minute, and then Nick Saban being the greatest college football coach of all time and bringing in recruiting classes the way somehow they just figure it out. So I don't know what your sense is on that one, but where do you think the rest of this season heads for them?
I don't think Alabama loses again until maybe the SEC championship game to Georgia. Yeah, I've fallen. I think at some point we've all fallen into the trap of asking, is this the end of the Alabama dynasty? And it isn't. Chris, my belief is that Nick Saban made a deal with the devil, and in the year 2375, after he wins his 400th national championship, he will be sucked down at midfield at Bryant-Denny Stadium into the depths of hell when the devil comes to cash in on his part of the pact. So Nick Saban is going to probably coach for another 300 years and die on the field and win 100 more national championships, and then we'll have this question, or people who are doing this job long after you and I are having that question. Look, man, I'm not going to doubt Nick Saban. He's the best coach in the history of college football. He is the antithesis of what we're talking about with Ed Orgeron, where he knows how to identify coaching talent. He knows how to get everyone to fall in line behind him. There's never been a better recruiter. There's never been anyone who's more maniacal about success and process and attention to detail, and he'll figure it out. He's got a young quarterback. He obviously they've got some injuries on the defensive side of the ball this year, guys that they were counting on. But even still, I think they'll go undefeated the rest of the way. They'll play Georgia in the SEC championship game, and that's going to be a fascinating conversation, Chris, because if Georgia beats Bama, Bama's likely a 2-loss Bama won't be in the playoff.
No.
If Bama beats Georgia, does the committee put 1-loss Georgia in along with Alabama? And my suspicion is that they would. So I think there's a lot of the line for the SEC the rest of the way. But I don't doubt Alabama. They got tripped up. A&M played the best game of their season. Calzada played the best game of his life. It all came together for him on a day. Jimbo's a good coach. It happens. But I'm not going to take that small sample and say this is the end of Alabama, because we've just made that mistake too many times.
Yeah, I'm with you. Georgia's clearly the number one team in the conference. Alabama, sorry, Kentucky, whoever, don't give me that. Alabama's the best team outside of Georgia. But here's what I think is really interesting. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 and 8. I don't know how you sort those teams apart from each other right now. And to me, the rest of the season is going to be really interesting. Who do you think are the next 2 or 3 teams in line behind those two?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to say Kentucky, which is odd, right? But, I mean, Kentucky beat Florida head-to-head, even though I think Florida probably was better. Outgained them. Kentucky won on a block punt for a touchdown, essentially. But Florida, Kentucky, I think are right there. It's really difficult when you look at the West because LSU has fallen off so far. I would love to have seen what A&M could have been with Haynes King this year, but we didn't. So is Zach Calzada going to keep coming into his own? We'll find out. But if I had to pick who that next team was, while there doesn't seem to be an obvious choice, I'm not telling you I think Kentucky is a national contender. I also look at skins on the wall, and that they're undefeated.
Mm-hmm.
They've beaten Florida. They've beaten LSU, and they deserve to be there until proven otherwise. I'll tell you, I was very high on Ole Miss this year. I actually, a couple of weeks ago, I picked Ole Miss outright to beat Alabama. Now, it didn't happen. And maybe Bama getting the scare against Florida was what they needed to center themselves for the game against Ole Miss. But I think Ole Miss can score on anyone. And I think DJ Durkin's a really good defensive coordinator and has them, this weekend against Arkansas notwithstanding, has them playing pretty competent defense for the most part. But, yeah, Kentucky. What's impressive about Kentucky, Chris, is that they're good at both lines of scrimmage. And if you can control the line of scrimmage, you can beat almost anyone on a given Saturday in college football, except the team that is just vastly more talented than you, like a Georgia or an Alabama. So I'd go Kentucky, oddly enough.
You think Florida's got any potential to be a fly in the ointment? I still think I wouldn't rank them third in the conference right now because Kentucky beat them head-to-head. But, I mean, they had a 170-yard edge in total offense. And, I mean, frankly, they look like the third-best team in the league to me. They've got speed. I'm not going to pick anybody to beat Georgia right now, but Georgia's not a juggernaut offensively. And Florida, with the quarterbacks who can run and make plays, I don't know. I'm not going to say I see an upset coming, but to me that game might be more sneakily interesting than people are picturing it right now.
I don't know if Florida will be able to run the ball against that Georgia defensive front, which looks really good. And about Georgia's offense, I'm inclined to agree, but we also saw Georgia with Stetson Bennett the last 2 weeks at quarterback have absolutely no problem. Against what was, in name anyway, a top 10 Arkansas team, although I don't believe they're a top 10 team, obviously, and then Auburn this past weekend. If you get a healthy JT Daniels back and some of those receivers start coming back healthy, look out, because you know they've got the offensive line. I mean, they have a big, nasty offensive line, and they've obviously got talent at running back with Zamir White and that whole group. So if JT Daniels gets healthy and you start to get some of those receivers healthy again, then Georgia is, in my opinion, head and shoulders above anybody else in all of college football and would be my pick to win the national championship. So let me see a healthy Georgia, how they look. And really for Kirby, that's just got to be what it's all about, man. Get to that SEC championship game, likely against Bama, healthy, and shoot your shot.
Yeah, you make a good point. I don't really think Florida's going to beat them. We're having to find things that could happen at this point because that's what we talk about. But, I mean, their talent 1 to 50 or 60 or wherever they go is just unbelievable. I mean, they haven't had Eric Gilbert. They haven't had the transfer from West Virginia, who I thought would be one of their starting DBs. They've had the Daniels injuries. It's plug and play down there right now. And outside Alabama, you just don't see it the way they've got. I know LSU had its title team a couple years ago, and a lot of that was just an offense that just couldn't be stopped. But Georgia's just plugging in guys. They'll play 24 guys on defense, and they just don't seem to drop off.
Kirby has, as you mentioned, he's, I think, expertly utilized the transfer portal, and he is recruited at an exceptionally high level, the level consistently we've only seen by Nick in Alabama, which is why they are as good as they are right now. There's still this part of me in the back of my head that goes like, until I see you do it, I'm going to have that doubt. I think that's the lingering doubt. Even though we saw them in the national championship game have Bama on the ropes until a freshman Tua came in and rallied Bama in overtime. But how different is the conversation about Georgia and Kirby if that game doesn't go to overtime? They win a national championship a few years ago. But those are all ifs, and they lost that game, and they're not going to get the benefit of the doubt until they win it. But I suspect they'll have the chance against Bama in the SEC championship game. And if I had to pick it today, I would pick Georgia because I think they're better at both lines of scrimmage. And at quarterback, if JT Daniels is healthy.
I think to better articulate my concern, right? Alabama, which is the most defense and running game program in the history of SEC football, Nick Saban figured out a few years ago that the way to win is get a great quarterback, get the ball to guys in space, and let them do things. And the defense has still been good, but it's not been vintage 1990 whatever Alabama or the ones he had a decade ago. Yeah. The thing that concerns me about Georgia is that's not the most cutting-edge offense. And, the running game sometimes doesn't, on a per carry basis, do as much as you might think it would do. I don't know. I'm with you. I'm going to bet on Georgia against anybody and everybody. But, if it goes wrong, that's my concern of where it goes wrong.
Yeah, could they throw themselves back into a game? And if JT Daniels is there, I think they can, because I saw him do it last November. I saw him do it in the Peach Bowl against Cincinnati, and I saw how efficient they were at the beginning of the season. Clemson game notwithstanding, when there was really no offense in that game. But I believe JT Daniels with those weapons is that guy that can do it. I think we agree. I'd bet on Georgia at this point. Even before Alabama lost to Texas A&M, if we had had this conversation a week ago, I would have told you the same thing. Because for me, I saw sort of the crack in the vase with Alabama against Florida. When Florida was down 21-0 in that game and rallied and was a 2-point conversion away from forcing overtime. So I think this will be a fascinating year, not only in the SEC, but in the playoff as a whole, because of the lack of obvious choices among the blue bloods we always just assume are going to be there, because of the deficiencies we've seen from Oklahoma and Ohio State, because Clemson already has 2 losses. It becomes a really interesting conversation, because you might actually have some new faces in that playoff this year.
Last question for you. I got to ask you about LSU baseball. The Jay Johnson hire seemed like a terrific one. He has really used the transfer portal to his advantage. That, to me, is going to be a fascinating program to follow next year and beyond. What's your take on him and what he's done so far?
In such a short amount of time, he has wowed everyone, from former players, current players, boosters, administrators. It's one of those guys that proves, when you have your perceived short list of candidates, sometimes if you're actually willing to go cast a wider net and do your due diligence and interview candidates, you might just stumble upon greatness. This might be blasphemy to some, but around Baton Rouge, people are comparing this hire to when LSU hired Nick Saban in football in late 1999. Wow. And they compare Jay a lot to Nick. Process-oriented, detail-oriented, maniacal recruiter, honest with all of his recruits that come in as players, which lends to people respecting him. He has won with his recruiting results immediately. Former players, which Chris, here the former players here take such an enormous ownership of the baseball program, because they're the ones that build the dynasty. The Bertman players that won 5 titles in 10 years. They're the players that continued that legacy and won a championship 10 years ago, or 12 years ago now, in 2009. And him embracing those former players creates an incredible generational bridge that is unifying the whole of the program, past and present. And then you go out and you go get Jacob Berry, and you get a guy like Eric Raiselman, who was throwing 100 miles an hour up in the Cape this year. I mean, this is a team that, I've talked to people I trust in baseball circles, scouts, and other people who, this is what they do. They look at this roster and they go, that's the team that should be in Omaha this year. Mm-hmm. And the way he's recruiting, they're probably going to be one of the favorites to win the national championship in 2 years. And that's the expectation here. That's even though it's been a while since LSU has won a national title. 12 years is a relative long time here. It's never, the expectation is never beneath that. That is the expectation every season here. And he's embraced it, man. And it's impressive what he's done. Now we got to see him coach a game.
Well, that lineup, if they stay healthy, has got the potential to be one of the best we've ever seen in the league. Now, the pitching I don't know about as much. That's kind of where they hurt last year. Of course, Jaden Hill's gone. Not that they had him a year ago, but that's the part where I'm really interested, because I think their bats are just going to be, you do not want to pitch to those guys.
They're going to slug, there's no doubt. Raiselman is like the name I mentioned. If people aren't familiar, you can go look up his highlights. He throws 100, and he's a guy they got from he was at the University of San Francisco. Fascinating guy. Lightly recruited, was cut from his high school baseball team, was going to give up baseball, but just kind of still had the dream, kept pitching, got a little stronger, had no offers, ended up going to San Francisco, and he just, it just clicked for him. And the velo picked up, and he had Tommy John, but he's healthy now, and he's throwing 100 in the Cape, and was the pitcher of the year for the summer, and he's the guy that'll likely be at the front of the rotation. There's some familiar names. Mikhail Hilliard's back. Devin Fontenot's back. You're gonna see a lot of young guys who pitched last year. Javen Coleman, some names that people maybe aren't familiar with, but really threw well as young guys last year. There's a lot of arms that could compete for those weekend spots. The one guy that you can rest assured will be there is Raiselman, and who else fills in behind that? I think you're spot on, Chris. I mean, that's the conversation here. They'll have the bats. They're gonna have a deep bullpen. Can they figure out that rotation? If they can, this is an Omaha team. Maybe not a national championship team, but you never know when you get to those 2 weeks in June. What could happen up in Omaha. But this is a team that has the potential to be there.
Matt, it's been a great conversation. Appreciate you joining me today. Tell people where they can follow your work on the radio, on social media, whatever you'd like to advertise.
Yeah, if you can spell I would say, Chris, if you can spell my name, you can find me, man. Because I'm on every social media platform you can find: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. It's Matt Moscona is my handle, Moscona, Matt Moscona. And then heard weekdays from 3 to 6 on ESPN radio stations all throughout Louisiana. But home base is in Baton Rouge at 1045ESPN.com.
Hey, Matt, thanks for joining us. Let's do this again soon.
Anytime, Chris. Thank you.